for Dr. J.
So today, we're discussing narrative poetry. I figured since we did
the novel
last week, it would be fair to dip into your forte.
My bailiwick.
Yes, your cup of tea.
My wheelhouse.
Your wheelhouse, yes. So, yeah. So we're going to talk about narrative poetry today.
Well, the reason why we have it is probably a good place to start.
Well, yeah, because, well, where does the novel come from?
It comes from narrative poetry.
Narrative poetry, right? That's why I thought this would be good. We're going backwards, but
it's fine.
It's fine.
You got to go back a long way.
Yeah, you do.
We've been telling stories forever.
Yeah. So it starts with oral traditions. And then, of course, those oral traditions get written down.
And the first one is Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
It's anyone who, you were talking today about the onus is on whoever.
Yeah.
In this case, the onus is on the people who say it's not the first work of written literature.
Right.
That they are the ones who have to prove it because all the evidence suggests
it was the first.
Gilgamesh is the first.
Does it predate the Egyptians?
It predates everything.
Okay.
It's old.
Yeah.
Mesopotamian. It is very old.
But the Egyptians aren't really dealing with narrative the same way either.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
No, they're not. And the poetry is very different. But the reason why we don't have the novel in prose in the very beginning is because nothing was written down.
Mm-hmm.
So you had to have some way to remember the story.
Mm-hmm.
And to continue to tell it accurately each time. So they relied on rhythm
mm-hmm.
and oral formulas to do it.
Right.
Had they had something akin to the printing press, then we might see prose.
Right.
But we just don't.
No.
We just don't. And you see these and what the novel, one of the great things about the novel is it gravitates away from this particular tradition, but the exciting part about narrative poetry is that for a very long time, obviously when you get into things like Don Juan and The Wasteland,
mm-hmm.
How you're not dealing with this anymore, but the tradition was always some grand hero, mm-hmm. this larger-than-life human being. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's Gilgamesh and Enkidu.
Right.
These two figures that are just, they tower over everyone around them. They mm-hmm. are that cool. And then we get to someone like Homer. Well, no, I take it back. So the Bible.
Yeah. Well, we discussed this. We talked about this over lunch. Does it count? Because the only real, obviously the Psalms, but that's not narrative poetry.
No, and the prophets aren't either. Job.
No.
Job may be the oldest of them, but it's not a narrative either.
No.
It's
a narrative, but it's not complete because it bounces.
Yeah, there's a narrative, but it's thin.
Yeah.
Most of it is a dialogue between Job and his friends, and then Job finally gets an audience with God, and God says, "What do you know?
Yeah.
Were you here when I created the universe? No? Okay, then shut up."
I'll spice it.
Where were we?
God.
Oh, God, yeah.
Dick.
Yeah, God being a dick. Because God's answer is entirely inadequate.
Mm-hmm.
The whole "I created the universe, you didn't do anything, shut up."
Right.
Still doesn't answer the question that Job is asking: why am I being made to suffer when I'm a good person?
Mm-hmm.
Job, the book, the poem, never answers that question.
Right.
Ever. It leaves it open. And I think that's the entire point. But to call that a narrative, there is a narrative. A narrative is at the beginning and at the end. Job loves God. Job's not a Jew.
Right.
But he loves God. An angel in God's court who's called Satan, which just means adversary or opponent, says, the only reason he loves you is because you're good to him. What will he do if you're not? And God's like, do your worst. Okay, why not? Takes away everything. Job still loves him, but Job is angry.
He
asks questions.
I think, and I think that is the biggest lesson from Job is that even in his anger with God, he still believes.
Yes.
He still loves him.
Yes.
He still worships him.
Yes.
Even though he's angry with him.
Yes. And God at the end says, okay, so now that I've let this bad shit happen to you, I'm going to give you even more stuff than you had before. More kids, a better wife, more stuff. But to call that a narrative, it's not a narrative.
It's not.
Hebrew literature, the Hebrew Bible doesn't do poetic narrative. It does prose narrative. And again, it's written down, and that's why they could do that. But Gilgamesh comes from a tradition before there's writing. So these stories of Gilgamesh and Enkidu and Ishtar and the Mesopotamian gods, all these stories predate writing, which is why it's in poetry.
Right.
We talked about Homer, and I had made this observation that I really like the idea of Homer because he's a poet and he's blind, and I'm a poet and I'm blind, and I feel a kind of kinship if he's real. Because there's always that question.
That's the first time I've ever heard you say, if he's real.
If he's real.
That kind of caught me off guard.
If he's real. I like to believe he is.
I threw what you always tell me on you.
It's true, though.
Well, it's the onus is on them.
The onus is on them.
Because as far as I'm concerned, he's real. Prove me wrong.
Yeah. Well, unlike Shakespeare.
And I get it, the scholarship.
Yeah. Unlike Shakespeare, though, whom we know wrote Shakespeare, and we know the person was real.
Why do you have to do this to me every week, Jason?
No, I'm just saying. We know the person was real. We don't have any evidence, like documented evidence, for Homer as a person.
I swear to God. If Jane Austen pops up in this podcast, I'm walking out.
I'm not going to talk about Jane Austen.
Okay, good.
If for no other reason, she's not worth it.
Yeah.
No, she's not a poet. She's a great novelist, but she's not a poet.
He's saying it, not me. Going back to the Epic of Gilgamesh, because I wanted, with narrative poetry, and then we'll get to, we have to talk about the Iliad, we have to talk about the story. And then, of course, then Beowulf, right? That's the next big one that comes.
In our language, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just...
As far as big narratives go, it's
big
there.
Poetic narratives, Beowulf, and then Eric and Enid, and then...
by the 1300s, we have Chaucer.
So, well, you got the Canterbury Tales.
Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote The Romance of the Rose.
Well, and here's a question. Do you count Morte d'Arthur?
No. No, I wouldn't. I mean, it's...
Because it's coming from narrative poems,
it does.
But he condenses it in prose.
And it's prose. So I would say to call it a narrative poem, it needs to have some sort of poetic structure.
Right.
And that was never the point for Morte d'Arthur, right? Yeah. Mallory's not trying to write a poem.
But he's pulling from them.
He's pulling from
That's
poetry.
The interesting thing. Because if you look at Gawain and the Green Knight, that's a narrative poem.
That's a narrative poem. And that one's interesting because no one knew what it was. It dropped out of circulation. They don't think it even had an audience in its own day, and then it was discovered.
Wow.
It had no currency in its own time. So we talk about the idea of a poet is great if he has influence. That poem had no influence. I mean, it does now. And it looms large on the literary landscape. But at that point, I mean, no one knew it. It was just some monk who wrote a poem.
Right.
And then it never made it anywhere. And then they discovered it, and it's like, oh my God, this is holy hell. I mean, it's incredible. It's a great poem. But we've moved well past. We got to go back.
Yeah. So anyway, it's a Gilgamesh. I think the beauty of Gilgamesh, being that it is like the earliest narrative poem, it's the first epic that we get.
The first work of literature.
Yeah.
I mean, it's everything.
Yeah. But I think what's interesting is, and this is where social memory kind of plays in, every major culture, every major civilization had a Gilgamesh-style story.
They did.
You know,
Especially the flood.
Yeah, I was getting ready to say if we look at, you know, the one that everybody all immediately ties to it is Noah. Noah's not the only one.
No.
I mean, even the Egyptians had a flood narrative.
They did.
There is. So what's interesting is that Gilgamesh is not just capturing the Sumerian oral traditions.
Yep.
It's capturing like this massive oral tradition that's been going on in other civilizations simultaneously.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Well, and in the case of the Bible, it's quite possible, because the Jews were sent into exile in Babylon,
Yeah.
that some of these myths, like the Noah myth, may have been written late
Right.
and taken directly from Gilgamesh.
Mm-hmm.
Like a good example of possible borrowing, and I may get this wrong, if someone's watching who understands the literature, they can correct me, but there's a point in Gilgamesh when he goes to the man who survived the flood, who will live pretty much forever.
Yeah.
Because Gilgamesh has lost Enkidu, his best friend, to death, and he doesn't want to die. And he talks to the old man, and the old man says, well, you need to get this fruit, and you'll live forever if you eat this fruit. So he goes, he finds the fruit, and a serpent takes it. This should sound kind of familiar.
Well, it sounds like that one season of Dynasty.
Okay. But maybe also the Bible.
Yeah, well,
Maybe also
you know,
the Bible.
I was thinking, you know, Hollywood.
Dynasty. Oh my God. Or Dallas.
Or Dallas. Or Falcon Crest. You remember Falcon Crest?
Yes. Dallas is the great epic poem of our time.
Right. Who hath shot J.R.?
God.
But I think that's the beauty of Gilgamesh is it's capturing a collective social memory.
Yes. Well, it's the Near East.
Yeah.
And these countries in the Near East, these cultures had a shared mythology, which is not at all surprising.
It's not just them, right? It's the Far East has it.
Yep.
If we look at Native Americans, there are a lot of the older tribes that are celebrating a flood narrative of some kind. Some kind. So it's everywhere. You know. So, and I think that's the beauty of Gilgamesh is that it captures it.
It does.
So then we said the next one was, of course, Homer, who was real.
He's real.
He's real.
I gotta believe it.
He's an Optic poet.
Yes, Virginia.
There is a Homer.
I gotta believe it. I gotta believe it.
Okay, so I think that's what I'm going to do next year with Jupiter. We're going to read Yes, Virginia
You should.
instead of the Bible, because we did the Bible this year. We'll do Yes, Virginia next year. It's such a good, what an article.
It's a great letter.
God.
It's a great letter.
It is. It was written in August.
No shit.
Yeah. She wrote her letter somewhere in like June or July, and he replied in August. He found it.
God.
Yeah. So it wasn't even at Christmas.
Well, kids worry about this stuff all year.
Yeah.
And yes, there's a Santa Claus.
Yeah. Yes, Virginia. There's a Santa Claus. And a Homer.
And a Homer.
And an Elvis. So,
And an Elvis.
who is the undisputed king of rock and roll. So.
And Shakespeare was real.
And Shakespeare.
And Jane Austen sucks.
You had to keep going, didn't you?
I couldn't help myself.
So anyway.
They'll love it. They'll love it. They have a sense of humor.
Yes. You don't understand.
So what does Homer do? Homer and the Greek tradition. What makes
the Iliad so special?
Well, okay, so there's a lot.
Right.
If you're really big into narrative structure. This is what you teach your students.
Yes.
I don't spend a lot of time on it because most of the poetry we read is lyrical poetry,
Right.
so there's no narrative.
Right.
But what Homer does, and he may or may not have created the structure, we have no way of knowing, but it's something that Gilgamesh doesn't do. So Gilgamesh tells the story from point A to point B,
Yeah.
to point C, all the way to Z. Homer says, I don't want to tell the story from the beginning.
Right.
I want to start in the middle. And then we'll work our way back.
Yeah.
And we're going to call it in medias res. In the middle of things. Now, why he chose this method, I don't know, but it became extraordinarily popular.
It's to create tension.
It is, well, it's weird.
Because what were we talking about on the way up here? He says from the beginning.
Sing goddess, sing goddess, the rage of Achilles.
Yes.
And then launches into crises and his daughter being taken by Agamemnon?
Yeah.
It's been a long time since I've read it. I didn't read it, obviously, this week because I didn't have time to read, 24 books of poetry. So I'm relying on my memory here.
But
and then it goes back. It starts to tell the story.
And then because you have to build the tension.
Yes.
This is the way narrative arcs work, right? To break it down in Vonnegut speak, you give the character who's thirsty, you have the glass of water, you spill the glass of water.
Yes.
Now you've got your story.
Yes.
How's it going to get more water? So what happens is that Homer starts the Iliad as the water spilling. Now we have to go back and understand why this is important.
Yes.
And the rage of Achilles. Why is Achilles mad?
Yes.
Why is Achilles angry? Why is Achilles, of all the people, why is he the one that we're focusing on, and why is he the one that is involved with this stupid war where Paris kidnaps Helen?
But according to literary history, no one had ever thought to do this before.
Yeah.
This was new.
Yeah.
It must have been absolutely shocking for a reader, or they weren't readers, for a listener to hear this poem performed and say, hang on.
Yeah.
We're not used to the story this way.
Well, and that's the other thing, right? The Iliad is written to be performed,
That's right.
not read,
In amphitheaters of all places.
which is interesting.
It is. Well, and that gets you into the question of literature means written work. So what do we do with the Iliad and the Odyssey? Because they weren't written down.
No.
Not for a long time.
Right.
I mean, this is one of the reasons I like the idea of Homer being real, because the magnitude of what he achieved as a single human being.
Right.
He didn't invent the stories.
Right. We were talking about that too. Which side is this? What's the reality of the Iliad? Did Homer come up with this all on his own, or did he take a group of stories that were not connected and sew them together to create this larger narrative about a war that may or may not have happened?
I want to believe it happened.
I do too, but I don't think it had to do with a girl.
No, of course it didn't have to do with a girl.
Okay, so here's the best trick that he pulled in that entire thing. He never describes Helen.
Nope. Leaves it all up to your imagination.
It leaves it to your imagination, so Helen can be anything you want her to be.
Well, how would you describe the most beautiful woman who ever existed? What words could possibly capture it? And Christopher Marlowe says it.
Yeah.
He doesn't describe her either, but he says in Faustus, is this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilion?
Yeah.
You don't have to describe her. She defies description.
Yeah.
She's not describable.
But by doing that, he allows you to do whatever you want to with her.
That's exactly right.
As far as the looks. You can make her look any way you want.
Yep. Apparently she was hot.
A little bit. Marlowe points out.
She's the Hester Prynne of the classical world.
Hester Prynne. What a woman.
Should do an entire show on Hester Prynne.
I have. Or just us.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could do that.
Not that I'll get to say a word, but
Yeah.
just be sitting here listening.
I did do a podcast called The Case for Hester Prynne.
I remember that.
Yeah. 45 minutes of me just drooling. And all I read was like 3 pages. So that's all you got to read. That's all you need.
That's wonderful.
Because she's insanely just amazing. And I made the argument in that podcast that, in my opinion, she's the greatest female character ever written. and the only one that comes close to her is Lady Macbeth.
The other thing about Greek narrative poetry and Roman narrative poetry, because you have to talk about the Aeneid too,
Yeah. Virgil.
is that, and
Well, and Dante.
Made it inside.
We did, man. We did.
Impressive.
It is way too cold out there, bro.
Yes. I'm just glad you got the table.
Yeah.
You gotta fight for it, man.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're not on your podcast. Though.
Yeah.
yeah, but we don't care. We don't care.
Oh, dude, we don't care. No, dude, we don't care.
It's not really
at this
crashing.
point, they're
It's a cameo.
expecting it. Yeah, it's your cameo, man.
I'm sorry.
One day they're going to see you.
Okay.
Are you ready for your close-up, Mr. DeMille?
Yeah. You doing okay, man?
Take care.
You doing all right?
Yeah, man.
Yeah?
I can't complain.
Well, you can, but who's going to listen, right?
That's exactly right. Cool. All right, guys.
Have a good one, man.
I also do, yeah, you're doing the usual for me, right?
What makes
And then Holly
there's
comes-
something else that makes this vein of literature so interesting that again Gilgamesh doesn't do. You read Gilgamesh. It's okay. For one, it's from beginning to end. Two, it never at any point invokes a deity to help
Right.
the poet write this.
Right.
The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, all of them
Yeah.
invoke a deity. And it becomes so set that if you read Paradise Lost, centuries later, he invokes the Holy Spirit to help him write this poem.
Right.
Because he's following the same narrative structure that Homer created.
And then you get Byron in, don't you?
Oh, cool. Okay, we're going to hold off on that. Well, no, we should probably say it now.
Are we going? Well, here's the thing. Are we going to talk about the Inferno?
I think well, the Inferno is weird too. Because it's not an epic, but it's a narrative.
Yeah.
It doesn't follow the rules.
No.
And it also tells the story from beginning to end. It doesn't launch in the middle. It's a straight narrative from the woods into hell, into purgatory, into paradise. So I think you can. I want to hold off on. Well, we can talk.
We'll back off. We'll talk about Don Juan later.
Yeah. That one's weird too because it's not built like a. It's not built like a.
See you, man.
It's not built like an epic either.
Yeah.
Though he invokes the muse.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later.
So anyway,
So they actually invoke deities, or in the case of Homer and
Virgil.
they invoke the muse. Help me write this thing. Help me to sing this thing because I can't do it on my own. I need your help, and this is what I need your help to do. I want to sing about the rage of Achilles. I want to sing about Aeneas. I want to sing about Odysseus, but I don't know how. So give me the words. Now, maybe by Virgil's time, Virgil didn't actually believe this.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter.
It doesn't anyway.
It's still a part of
tradition.
it. It's tradition.
Well, it's kind of like the chorus, right?
It is like the chorus.
Because if you look at Shakespeare, what's he do? Every once in a while, he brings in a chorus.
That's right. So those pieces, and they also are, and it's especially true of Virgil. And Virgil is strange in that, so we know who he is. We know he was real. We have no doubt.
Right.
And he wrote it down.
Yeah.
It was not orally transmitted.
Right.
It was written down. Unlike the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were written down much later. And it's also half the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's only 12 books as opposed to the 24 books that you see in the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Well, then let's look at, okay, so
I'm completely incompetent to talk about the Aeneid. It's been a long time.
I don't think I've ever read it.
It's good.
I know what it is and I know who he was.
It's the foundational myth for Rome.
What's interesting is that I learned more about Virgil when we went over Dante
Well, you kind of have to.
because Virgil was the guide.
He's there.
Yeah.
He's there.
And we had to look at why Dante is bringing him in.
Yes.
What's the purpose?
Yes.
Right? Okay, so Gilgamesh is capturing this oral tradition of a flood narrative.
Yes.
We get to the Iliad and the Odyssey, we're capturing multiple oral stories, bringing them together and
Yes.
sewing them together. So we have this long narrative. What is the purpose of Beowulf?
Okay, this is a
loaded question.
This was my master's degree.
Yeah, I know. That's why I asked it.
I translated that motherfucker. So Beowulf is interesting too. It doesn't have the epic structure of in medias res, beginning end. It's a straight narrative. Well, no, it's not. But it's a narrative that starts at A and ends at Z, and it makes all these digressions about lineage and looking at how other kingdoms fell because of a dispute over whatever. But the point of Beowulf and the strange thing, so there's I don't remember his first name, but named Broger. Broger was a Beowulf scholar, and he wrote either an essay or a book basically saying that Beowulf was drawn from 3 different stories.
Well, that actually makes sense.
One, the story of Grendel, the story of Grendel's mother,
Yeah.
the story of the dragon. And that the Beowulf poet tied it together. We also are almost absolutely certain that a single person wrote it.
Right.
All the evidence points to one person did this. They might have taken the stories and borrowed them. The person also would have had to have been a monk. And we know he was a monk because he has too much knowledge of patristic and church tradition not to be. And he was literate.
Yeah.
So the Beowulf poem talks about shops, which are poets, except they would have played a harp to break the middle of each line. But we know with absolute certainty that's not how Beowulf was written.
Yeah.
Beowulf is a Christian poem. And what makes Beowulf so interesting for its time is that it attacks Anglo-Saxon warrior culture.
Right.
And says, you're wrong. And it spends the entire tale building up Beowulf as being this great hero. And at the very end, he's old, an old king in Gateland, and he decides he's going to fight this dragon because the dragon's been killing his people because some slave went into the dragon's lair and stole the cup, which is where we get Lord of the Rings from. And because Tolkien was an Anglo-Saxon scholar.
Yeah.
And Beowulf, at the end, he's able to successfully stab the dragon and give him a fatal wound, but in the process, he's going to die now. He's got a fatal wound. And he asks before he dies to see the gold. That's all he wants. And then in the burial scene, when they bury him in the mound, they say they bury the gold with him, quote, useless as it ever was to men. So what makes... So Beowulf, it's a good contrast to Gilgamesh. Because the Epic of Gilgamesh is drawing all these elements from Mesopotamian, Near East, Far Eastern culture. But it doesn't criticize them.
Right.
It's just they're just a part of the story. The Beowulf poet rips Anglo-Saxon and Norse culture apart and says, this is not the way of God. Gold and stuff gets in the way of any kind of real relationship with God. So it is an unashamedly, unabashedly Christian poem. And it's one of the first... we think it's the only long Anglo-Saxon poem. It's the only long one we have. But nothing in Anglo-Saxon literature tears Anglo-Saxon culture apart more than Beowulf.
So from a narrative standpoint, one of the things I always loved about Beowulf is you build up to Grendel.
Yes.
Grendel comes into the hall.
Yes.
He kills him. And his mom shows up.
Whoops.
And she's worse. And then you get the lineage of Cain.
That's right.
And then he kills her. You're
Yes.
thinking, okay, because there's a build-up for that, too.
Yes.
He kills her. That's the one he goes into the woods and kills, right? He goes into the lair.
He goes into the mirror in the water. Her lair is underwater.
Yeah.
And he kills her with the sword he finds in the mirror, in her lair or den, and he brings the the only thing left, because her blood melts the blade, and the only thing left is the hilt. And he brings the hilt to Hrothgar, and they have no idea what they're looking at.
Right.
But the poet describes it as the flood, and how human beings were wiped out because they were too violent. That's the poet's take on the flood myth.
Yeah.
That Noah is being told by God to do this because human beings have become violent, and they have to go.
I always thought that for me was the most fascinating part, was he gets rid of Grendel, and then
Grendel's mom shows up.
a larger threat shows up.
She's not as strong as Grendel, but she
No.
is pissed.
She's a bigger threat.
She is.
You know, it intensifies, and so the narrative gains even more acceleration as it moves through.
Yeah. And then you get a break. you get a welcome break, and life's going to be good in Herod again, and he goes home. And he becomes king years later.
And then the dragon.
Who is the worst of all of them,
Yeah.
because Beowulf can't live through it.
Yeah.
And Beowulf is criticized because he should have sent younger men. He's too old to fight. But he does it anyway because he has I think the Anglo-Saxon word they would use is overmode, which means excessive pride.
Right.
I love Beowulf.
So then, move forward a little bit more. Okay, so what do you do with the Canterbury Tales?
Well, the Canterbury Tales is weird.
Because
okay?
it's a long narrative broken up into smaller
Several
narratives that are building on each other.
They're framed. What makes the Canterbury Tales so unusual?
Plus, they're never finished.
Yeah. Well, so there's an argument about that.
But he doesn't. Okay, he doesn't do what he set out to do.
He doesn't do what he set out to do. But in the beginning of the Canterbury Tales, the owner of the hostelry and the host tells the knight to open his purse, meaning to begin your story. And at the very end, he tells the parson to close the purse. But what we think is Chaucer was writing these tales, and he's like, this is really tiring.
Yeah.
I can't possibly write this many. I'm just going to end it right here. So he finished it, but he did not finish it.
Right.
He just couldn't do it. But what makes the Canterbury Tales bizarre, and it's unusual for its time, but it's a kind of pointing forward to the novel, is he gets the idea of the Canterbury Tales from the Black Decameron. It's not the Black Decameron's a song, from the Decameron, which is written by Boccaccio, the Italian writer, and it's in prose. So he gets the idea for this long poem from a prose writer.
Right.
And that is weird. That is weird. And he like the Beowulf poet is criticizing his own time. And he's absolutely hilarious. He makes poetry funny. Which we really...
The Wife of Bath.
We hadn't seen a lot of funny poetry before. But he makes it hilarious. Oh, The Wife of Bath and The Miller's Tale. I teach those when I teach Chaucer.
Yeah.
And the students are shocked. They're absolutely shocked when we get to the part in The Miller's Tale where Hindi Nicholas grabs Allison by the quaint. No, I don't know what's his word mean, and I write it on the board. I write it in the Middle English, Queuynt, and then below it, in big letters that cover half the board, I write Cunt, and they're like, "Oh my God!" Like, well, it wasn't a bad word back then. It wasn't. You weren't going to go to hell for saying it, but this would have been absolutely funny.
Well, the way they throw that around in Britain today, you're not going to go to hell for saying it.
You wouldn't say it on the radio.
It's America that has a problem.
You wouldn't say it on the radio, and you wouldn't say it to your mom. But if you said it to a friend, no one would care. It's not it's not as big of a deal. It's like the F-bomb here.
Yeah.
I mean, it ain't great, but it's not going to land you in jail. But if you say it here, you're in big trouble, pal.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll notice even for this podcast, I refuse to say it. I just spelled it because I thought it's a. I mean, I'm fine with the word. I have no problem with it. I love the word because it packs a punch, but I'm not going to use it in this country because I don't want to die. But Chaucer takes the church to task. in these, and really makes the church look bad. And he makes fun of the wealthy. No one is safe from Chaucer. Nobody.
So go ahead.
And around the same time we have Gowan.
Yeah.
Written during the same century, around the same time that Chaucer is writing the Canterbury Tales.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's not just Gawain. There are several.
There are
Arthurial narrative poems that come out, but Gawain is the most famous.
What makes Gawain or Gawain, whatever?
I was always taught Gawain.
It doesn't matter.
Or Gawain.
We don't really know, right?
Yeah.
Gawain or Gowan, for one, it doesn't have a title.
Right.
That's an editorial title.
Well, and the other thing is that what's always interesting about that particular narrative, right? When you look at what happens in Mort d'Arthur, Gawain's a secondary player.
He is.
And in that poem, he's a secondary player. Because it's for the couple. Remember?
Oh, for what, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight?
Yeah.
Well, he's big, but, I mean, he's the hero, but he looks bad in the poem. And so this is what happens with narrative poetry. The closer we get to the 21st century, is the narrative is used as a means of social critique.
Yeah.
And what the Gowan poet is critiquing is ideas of chivalry, and says chivalry is a stupid system that doesn't work, because the whole poem is built around it.
The whole precipice is that they hire him to defend her honor, right?
What, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight?
Yeah.
No.
What is it? Okay.
You're talking about another poem, I think. No, Gowan is there. Gowan is there. It's Christmas time, King Arthur's court, and they're having a great time. And this giant green knight comes in and challenges one of them to hit him with the blade of the axe. And it was going to be King Arthur, and Gowan says, "No, I'll do it. I'll do it. I got this."
Right.
And he chops his head off. And the knight reaches down, grabs his head, and tells him, because the whole deal is, in a year and a day, you're going to have to come meet me in the Green Chapel, and I'll get to take a swing at you. So Gowan realizes, oh, I'm so fucked.
Yeah.
So they wait a year, and then all of a sudden, it's near Christmas time again. So Gowan's like, I guess I got to go now. And he's on his way to the Green Chapel. He's exhausted. It's wintertime. He's lost. He finds this castle. They welcome him in. And then he gets to know the lord of the castle, whose name later we learn is Bertilac. And Bertilac and Gowan come up with not really a wager, but a system that Bertilac will go out hunting during the day, and he'll bring back whatever he brings back. He has to give to Gowan. Whatever Gowan receives while he's in the castle, he has to give back to Bertilac. So Bertilac's wife comes into Gowan's bedroom on several occasions and tries to kiss him, and actually kisses him once.
Right.
When Bertilac comes back, he gives him what he killed that day, and Gowan has to kiss him. And then on the last time, I could be mistaken about the episodes, she gives Gowan a green belt. But she basically says, you're not allowed to tell anybody with this green belt. But this green belt will keep you from dying. So when the Lord comes back, when Bertilac comes back, Gowan doesn't give him the green belt. He hides it, which breaks the chivalry code. But either way, he's going to break the code. This is the whole point of the poem, is no matter what he does, he's going to end up breaking the code. Hang on, okay, there we go. My foot got hung up in the cord. And so then it's time for him to go fight the Green Knight. Or actually let the Green Knight hit him. The Green Knight, of course, tries to strike him. And he misses the first time because Gowan flinches, and Gowan's like, I'm really sorry. I'm sorry. It's not cool. We'll do it again. Do it again. And he can't cut his head off because he's wearing the green belt.
Right.
Then he finds out that the Green Knight is Bertilac, the lord in the castle. And that the person who gave him the power to do that is Morgan Le Fay. that gave him the spell to transform himself into the Green Knight.
Of course, it's Morgan Le Fay.
And he goes back home. He's wearing his green sash, but he feels awful because he's cheated. But since the Green Knight is Bertilac knows he's cheated because Bertilac sets up the entire scenario so that the wife is doing exactly what Bertilac wants her to do. He's exposing the chivalric code for what it really is. It's a series of elaborate...
it's Morgan Le Fay taking a shot at Arthur.
It's what it looks like.
That's what it is.
It's what it looks like.
Yeah.
That's Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And again, he takes a pot shot at chivalry as an idea and says it's not tenable. And you're placing chivalry before God, and that's not okay either. Because again, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is written by a monk. Now the poem you love is
Eric and Enid.
Yeah, and this is one I don't know well.
And that's probably what I'm getting mixed up with.
Probably.
Because it's a couple. The Eric and Enid, what happens is at the beginning, Eric and Enid are together. They get separated. The entire poem are letters between themselves. And how they slowly, through the letters, you start to see them coming back together. And then at the end, they come back together. But it's all these different stories of the adventures they go through while they're apart. And they're separated because there's this big battle, and he has to go fight in the battle, and he gets captured and taken away.
Oh.
And so the rest of the poem is her and him, like him being captured and her trying to find a way to get back to him, even in captivity. And she said, at one point in the poem, she says, if they're going to keep you captive, I want to be captive too. I mean, it's this thing like she's not trying to rescue him. She just wants to be there.
This is the poem you were getting mixed up with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Because there's an authorial knight in that poem that Eric ends up meeting. I can't remember who it is, but it's one of the Arthurian knights of the Round Table that Eric ends up becoming friends with while he's in captivity.
But he's a bit player.
Yeah. Because the focus is on Eric and Enid. But like I said, at the end, they finally come back together. But the entire structure of the poem is letters back and forth between the two of them. As they're communicating. And they're telling each other what's going on. And then at the very end, the Arthurian knight that he's with helps him go free. And he meets her at a little inn in a small town because she's getting closer and closer to him. She's getting closer to where they're keeping him because she doesn't know where he is. And part of the unique point of view from his letters is he's giving her clues to where he's at.
And where's this written?
It's written in England.
Okay, I thought so.
Yeah. It's either England or France, one of the two. It's coming out of that northwestern part of Europe. But yeah, it's during that same period.
And what's the point? I mean, because I mean, we've been talking about what the narratives do to challenge something. In the case of
this one is a love poem. This is
a love poem.
It's a love poem. That's all it is. It's the narrative of separation and trying to get back. And he finally gets back to her.
It's touching.
It is.
And kind of nice that it's not about some social issue, because a lot of these poems are taking on social issues.
So jump forward just a little bit, and you've got Dante.
Yeah.
What is the point of the Inferno? It's propaganda. It's not social. It's not talking about social. I mean, it talks about social issues, but that's not the point.
Yeah. And it does attack the church in some pretty nasty ways when he puts popes in hell, which I find extraordinarily entertaining.
Yeah, but which popes are they?
They're the bad ones.
Well, they're the ones that, you know, oh God, what's the family name?
Oh, the Medici?
They're mostly the ones Medici put in power. He's not attacking the church. He's going after the family.
I love that poem so much.
That's the thing, right?
I like the part where people who commit fraud or basically con men have to eat shit, literally. That makes me happy.
Yeah. But it's propaganda.
Sure
That
it is.
poem is nothing but propaganda.
Sure.
And then we get Milton.
Okay. I love Paradise Lost.
Yes.
Paradise Regained can suck it.
Well, Paradise Lost. Okay, so you love to talk about Lolita, but one of the things you pointed out to your own students is that you can't help but root for Satan.
You love Satan. You love him.
Because the way Milton builds this.
Well,
and you're right.
And the problem is Milton can't write God. So
Yeah.
God in Milton is really boring. And just like, I don't care about you. I
Yeah.
mean, if God is anything like this God, I want to go to hell. Because Milton's Satan.
It's fantastic.
He's fantastic. But what makes Milton so peculiar and what makes Paradise
Kind of like
Lost...
Mephistopheles in Faust.
That's right.
Faustus.
What I like so much about Paradise Lost and what's so powerful is that no one had ever attempted this before.
Yeah.
To write a Christian epic that actually does start in the middle of things, in medias res, and then goes back. It's amazing. And the Satan that you read, oh my God.
Yeah.
Defiant until the end, and you end up rooting for this son of a bitch. What is my problem? Why do this is wrong that I want Satan to succeed? Because you know what's coming.
Could you argue that he created the anti-hero?
I think you could make that claim, but I think Milton would be deeply disturbed with us enjoying Satan as much as we do.
Yeah.
Unless you take what Stanley Fish points out. And Stanley Fish, despite his sins, really does a good job with Milton.
You know, anytime we talk about Stanley Fish, we recognize that he is an idiot, but then we talk about the good things that he's done in his life.
Because he's wonderful.
He is.
Reader response criticism was earth-shattering.
Yeah.
It changed the landscape in a really good way because
did.
it reminded us, well, there's a reader.
Yeah.
Maybe we should talk about the reader.
reader.
No one had ever talked about the reader before. But he wrote a book called Surprised by Sin, and the point he makes, the premise is that Milton creates this character that you love so much. And by making you love him so much, he makes you as the reader fall the way Adam and Eve did.
Ooh.
Yeah. He causes the reader to sin by loving Satan.
Wow.
Yeah. It's a brilliant idea.
That is.
It's a brilliant idea.
You think Milton thought that?
I don't know. Milton was a Puritan dude. He was all sorts of screwed up. That's what I don't like about Milton. So I have problems with Milton the way you have problems with Emerson.
Yeah.
I love Milton's writing. I like the fact that Milton wrote an entire tract supporting divorce.
Yeah.
He said that if a husband and wife can no longer have a conversation, that's ground for divorce. And he's writing this in the 17th century.
Well, shit. That was from day one.
Yeah. Those are moments you think about editing out, right?
I'll be dead by Tuesday.
When do you post this?
It'll go up tomorrow morning.
Yeah, that's when you die.
Somewhere around 11
I'll give you till the
tomorrow
afternoon,
morning.
if you decide to leave it in there.
I didn't say which one.
The other thing about Paradise Lost is the fact
There are three options there, Jason.
Yeah, he's using unrhymed iambic pentameter verse. So he's creating this really expansive poetry that at moments starts to sound like prose. You lose the meter and you feel like you're just reading a prose piece. He just had that kind of ear.
Okay. When's Milton writing?
Early 1600s.
Okay.
Early to mid 1600s.
He's right after Shakespeare.
Yes. And he's influenced by Shakespeare. That's
I
where
was
the
getting
blank.
ready to-
That's
I'm
where the
getting
blank
ready to-
verse came from.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's because of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And he acknowledges that.
Okay.
Yeah. It's not like he's hiding it. I mean, it's obvious to everyone.
Wait. Are you saying that John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, recognizes that a man named Shakespeare
Wrote Shakespeare.
wrote Shakespeare? Is that what you're suggesting, Jason?
And what about Jane Austen? No.
Jesus Christ.
So no, he's writing in blank verse, much the same way that Shakespeare and Marlowe were. I think he gives him credit.
All I can tell you is right now I can hear assholes.
I'm sure.
But yeah, I think. Well, and at the same time, in all seriousness, what's Ben Jonson doing?
Yeah, he's writing in blank verse.
He's writing in blank verse too. I mean,
They all
they're
are.
pulling from it. Marlowe gets in on that.
Well, Marlowe's the reason we have it.
Yeah.
We don't have blank verse in the theater without Marlowe. And then Shakespeare reads Marlowe. He's like, oh my God. Well, to be more accurate, Shakespeare doesn't read Marlowe. Shakespeare went to the plays
Watched Marlowe.
and said, this is really cool.
This is cool.
Kid, I don't know if you know what you got. What do you think about me using it? And not that Marlowe invented blank verse either.
Right.
The Surrey, Henry Howard, whom Henry VIII had beheaded, invented blank verse.
Right.
And then Marlowe's like, that sounds really good. And then Shakespeare said, that sounds really good. And Johnson's like, well, both of you are doing it. I can do it better.
Yeah.
And he doesn't, but he thought he could.
Ben Jonson reminds me of that punk-ass little kid that thinks he knows everything.
Yeah. Oh, he insults Shakespeare. Even though they were friends, he said that Shakespeare, quote, knew a little Latin and less Greek.
So, Jason, what you're telling me is that a well-known British playwright named Ben Jonson recognized that there was a dude who wrote Shakespeare.
Yes. In fact, he was one of the people responsible for putting together that first folio
No.
after Shakespeare had died.
Yeah.
Just putting that out there. So we get Milton. We move into the Augustan period when you
Yeah.
get the next big one, which is the Rape of the Lock,
Yeah.
which is making fun of the epic.
I was getting ready to say
That makes fun of the epic
that's
tradition,
satirical stuff.
and it's wonderful.
because okay, so explain what the lock is.
It's a lock of hair.
Yeah.
Belinda's lock of hair.
Yes.
That the Lord cuts and takes, which actually happened. And Pope has been charged to write this poem to iron things out. And everyone loved it. And it's fantastic.
It is the only poem in the history of language that deals with the most asinine event in history.
Yes. And it's an epic structure.
It is.
And it's absolutely wonderful.
It is. It's satire.
I'm trying to speed this up a little bit.
Well, you have to remember, yeah, we're going to jump. You got to remember, Swift is writing at the same time.
Yes, he is.
There's no way Pope is not reading Swift and Pope is not picking up the satire.
And Swift is reading Pope.
Yeah, and he picks up the satire, and
He does.
that's the beauty of Rape of the Lock is it's one big satirical
Oh, it's beautiful.
farce.
He also does it in the Dunciad, which is also great. But
Yeah.
Rape of the Lock is, I think, it's the peak of satirical epic poetry.
Yeah,
And it's not that long.
no, it's an easy read.
And then you get to the Romantics who decide to play with it even more, but really the only one who does a great job
It's Coleridge.
is, well, Coleridge writes a really great epic.
Yeah,
That's the first generation.
yeah.
In the second generation, you have Byron who's like, let's write a 500-page poem called Don Juan.
Well, hold on. Let's talk about Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Yeah, no, I think we should.
Yeah, before we jump on back, I'm going to cut you loose on Don Juan because we still got to talk about the Wasteland. Because the Wasteland changes everything.
The Wasteland blows everything up.
It blows everything up, but it changes the way we view narrative poetry, and then Hal comes along and runs with it.
Yes.
But when we look at
The Rime of the Ancient
the
Mariner.
Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Okay, I asked the same question I asked about Beowulf. What are we supposed to get out of it?
Well, I think, so there are a couple of things. It's complicated, but there are a couple of things he's doing. So there are two distinct versions. The one that was published in 1798 and 1800, and that one didn't have those marginal glosses
Right.
that actually make the poem harder. Like a paragraph on the moon.
Like we've talked about.
Oh my God, and I talked about it today with the students. I'm like, so the glosses make sense until this point, and then they just go off the rails.
Yeah.
Why? And they didn't have an answer.
Because the heroin kicked in.
Yeah. Well, he did have a lot of opium.
Yes.
But what he's doing and what makes him such a great, what makes that poem such a great contribution is that instead of looking at epics, he looks at folk ballads and says, I'm going to write a folk ballad, except I'm going to elevate it.
What'd they call it? Lyrical ballads.
They call it lyrical ballads,
Yeah.
Which in itself is a contradictory name, but that's
Well,
the
so
end
is
of it.
Leaves of Grass.
Yes. Yeah, it doesn't, I mean, just again.
It means nothing.
Yeah. It's weird because he avoids, I think, very carefully the epic tradition.
Yeah.
And what makes it also powerful is he doesn't appear to have any social commentary there. One of our students we have in common today mentioned this. He's like, I was reading it and I couldn't tell if this was supposed to be a metaphor for something. I'm like, well, I don't think anyone's supposed to know. It almost looks like a poem for its own sake.
Yeah.
That has no social value at all. It has no reference point. It's not pointing to a culture and saying this is where we've gone wrong. No, it's not even Christian. It's just there.
Yeah.
It's an object in the world that seems to be just this crazy ass story.
And the guy has to keep telling it
Over and over again. That's right. So I don't know what to say about it except he's playing with popular ballads, which also have no use value.
There you go. So that's it. That's what I was pushing you towards.
Yeah.
Was this idea that here you have this epic poem that actually doesn't have any rhyme or reason to exist.
None.
Why? Because what he's building off of has no rhyme or reason to exist to begin with.
And no one had ever...
It's there for entertainment.
I
and
think
it's pure entertainment.
I think it is the wasteland of its day.
Yeah.
Because I think poets read it and said, where do we go from here?
Yeah.
And then Byron responded,
With Don Juan.
we make it funny.
Yes.
Let's write something that's so stupid and so shallow and so superficial and so hilarious and make it out like an epic. So that it's about this, and we're calling it Don Juan not because we're idiots, because it looks like Don Juan.
Yeah.
But the British can't say anything without turning it into an anglicization, right? So they couldn't say Juan, so they just said Juan. And so Byron's making fun of British people by calling it that. But the best part, and he's not writing an epic poem either, but he points to it.
Yeah.
But he doesn't give any respect to epic poetry because when he points to it, it's one of the cantos in the book. He opens the book up with "Hail Muse," etc.
Well, it's kind of like Vonnegut at the beginning of Cat's Cradle.
Yes.
Call me Jonah. Or John. Or James. My parents call me James.
So Byron makes it funny. He takes the tradition and says, why can't we do something with this that's not so serious? Let's have fun. And it is a rollicking story. It's a massive story about this poor kid who just happens to fall into the worst and best situations. He has no control over anything that happens to him. Things just happen to him.
Right.
He makes nothing happen. It's just everything happens to him.
Right.
And the women that come out of the woodwork in this story, it's amazing. And he's constantly the object of someone's desire. But he's just a kid and he's confused.
Right.
And he's wonderful. He's absolutely wonderful. And it's refreshing because after you read so much of this poetry written by the Romantics, it's like, oh my God, there's only so much I can take.
Yeah.
And then you get Don Juan, it's like, oh, thank you, Jesus.
Well, you would say the same thing about Song of Myself.
Yes.
But okay, so here's the thing about Song of Myself.
Oh my God.
It's not an epic poem.
No, it's not. But it's long. Yeah.
And he doesn't break it up until like what, the 4th edition?
It's late.
That's when he starts numbering them.
That's right.
Because he kept adding.
You got to have some stamina to read the first one.
And I told my students this when we were looking at it. He didn't add. He inserted.
That's right.
He was dropping new stanzas in to shape even. But even then, the narrative is disjointed because there's no clear narrative.
No.
It's just it's one man's observation. It's not even his journey.
No.
It's an observation.
But you expect as a reader that something this long is going to have some sort of narrative structure, and you
Yeah.
find out as you go along, oh my God, I've been reading this for 10 pages,
Nothing's happened.
and still nothing's happened.
Yeah. It's just observation.
Yeah.
The whole thing is observation. The entire stands on where the kid looks at him and says, "What is grass?"
Yep.
It's just him thinking.
Now, if you want to talk about some of the worst worst narrative poetry ever written, you have to talk about his colleague.
We don't know.
I just want to talk about how bad he is.
No.
Can I mention his name?
No, let's not invoke
No,
him.
to make him look bad.
If we invoke him, he will
It's
come.
like looking in the mirror and saying Bloody Mary 3 times. Longfellow, Longfellow, Longfellow.
The line by Pound. They desperately wanted a tradition, and they got Longfellow.
He's horrible. He's a wretched poet.
He is.
The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. Eveline, is that one? Or Evangeline? Evangeline, also terrible.
Yeah.
I've read more Longfellow.
Pound calls that one out by name.
It's awful.
He says, and they got Longfellow. And then the next sentence is, Evangeline did nothing.
And Hiawatha, which is also terrible.
Hiawatha,
I've read more Longfellow than I would like to remember. So let's forget him.
You know what? Well, I'll say this and then we'll move on. Tell my students, Longfellow is Longfellow is what happens when Harvard is desperate for anybody to teach a class.
Yes.
And that's how we got that bastard.
Can we successfully move on now to
Yes.
what happens after the First World War?
Yeah.
And go.
Because you're tired of talking.
No,
okay, so here's the unique thing. Okay, so go back to the Civil War. Because when you look at Ode to a Confederate Soldier by Tate later, what we see is the narrative poem shifts, especially here in America.
Yes.
Now, in Europe, it's going to shift in a minute, but it shifts immediately following the Civil War because all of a sudden we start to see the entire ecosystem, social ecosystem, break down. Because you had two powerful cultures, and now there's just one. And so that other one has just fallen out, which yields to this new idea in the South of seeing the world as a broken place. Now, what ends up happening is you have all this regional writing. During the last 40 years or 30 years of the 19th century, that's coming out of not just the South, but the Midwest as well, because you're starting to see that push towards the West, and they become like this little tunnel that, well, not tunnel, but like this bypass that people are funneling through. And they're getting all these stories from the East, and then they're getting all these stories from the West. Transcontinental Railroad is complete, and all of a sudden, all these narratives converge on the Midwest. So you have all this regional writing coming out of that. When you look at Willa Cather, Kate Chopin, they're coming out of the Midwest. They're bringing all these new narratives out. And in the South, they've got this broken homeland narrative that is festering and festering. You put all this together, and you have this disjointed, Pound calls it a mongrel nation, this disjointed patchwork of narratives. While that's happening, narrative itself is being reinvented. And when they go to Paris, they take it with them without realizing they take it with them. And I proved this in one of my seminar papers with Hemingway, specifically with The Sun Also Rises and Farewell to Arms. Because in both instances, he does exactly what Faulkner does and what Sinclair Lewis does and what Kate Chopin does with The Awakening. You take them out of their element, they die. Leave them in their element, they live. The minute you cross that border, done.
Quentin.
Quentin, Aerosmith. What it was the character, the protagonist of The Awakening. They took her out of Kentucky and brought her to New Orleans.
And she dies.
And she dies. In high society, she doesn't belong. Look at My Antonia, right? Same thing. Take her out of the element, she dies. There's a wonderful story by Willa Cather about this kid who goes to Philadelphia. He leaves like rural Ohio, moves to Philadelphia, ends up committing suicide. Has a gun in his pocket, steps in front of a train. Of course, the question is, why is he stepping in front of the train instead of shooting himself? And the obvious answer, if you look at the way this story is built, it's a metaphor that the industrial Northeast is just going to run everybody over. It doesn't matter.
Yep.
So again, you have that, and narrative changes. So again, they take it to Paris with them. When they leave, they go to Paris, and the expatriates look at Gatsby. Every fucking one I can bring back to Gatsby. Because what is Gatsby? These two Midwestern kids, Jay Gatz and Nick,
Yep.
go to New York. What happens? One ends up dying. The other one leaves New York with his tail tucked between his legs.
Disillusioned by the Jazz Age.
By the Jazz Age. Yes. Because he went to a Gatsby party. Right?
The Gatsby party doesn't stop.
Myrtle.
Yeah. Yes.
Myrtle doesn't belong.
No.
And she dies.
And she dies.
So they carry that with them. And Pound is picking up on that, and he's funneling that to Eliot as Eliot is writing this poem. All of that coalesces on top of the fact that when they come out of the First World War in Europe, the entire world is disjointed.
It's in ruins.
It's in ruins. Everything they understood is dead. Right? And so the Wasteland shifts the epic narrative poem by giving us many narratives that you string together to this one larger narrative. But each one is so disjointed and so broken. By the time you get to the end, he's sitting on the shoreline. It's one of the greatest moments in all of poetry. He's sitting on the shoreline, facing the sea. He says, the wasteland is behind him, and he says, shall I put my lands in order? In other words, shall I put all this together?
You can't, though, because earlier in the poem he talks about shored fragments.
And what is he? Well, that's the thing, right? When he ends the poem, the next three lines are, is it Sanskrit?
Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Yeah, Sanskrit.
Yeah. And what is he saying? He's not going to, he can't.
No, nobody can.
It's broken. And so we end we end the poem with the wasteland to our backs, facing the ocean, facing the sea. We're facing rebirth. Something new is coming, but the old is gone. It's too broken, right? And so he that's the narrative. And the narrative is, it's broke.
Which is why what you get is you get pieces of stories.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the beginning, you think, okay, so we're going to have the story of this little girl. Mm-hmm. And then that disappears.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you're in a pub. When did that happen?
Well, don't forget, in between the little girl and the pub, the game of chess.
Yes. Then the fire sermon and all these other things.
Yes.
It's like...
And then there's this weird moment where Jesus shows up.
And we have no idea why.
Because they're on the road. It's that moment from the Gospels where it's the two disciples and Jesus.
The road to Emmaus.
The road to Emmaus. You're on the road to Emmaus.
Yep.
And he's gone.
Yep.
And of course, he's playing with this idea that religion was there, and now it's dead.
Yep. Even though Eliot is a devout Anglo-Catholic.
Yes. But what did World War I do?
Yeah.
It ruined everything.
It did.
Because also the question is, how could God let this happen? I mean, it's just... On top of all that, as we've already mentioned in this podcast, and we've said this several times in other podcasts, the wasteland is the moment where we take poetry as far as we can take it. So fast forward, 35 years, maybe?
Mm-hmm. 40s.
Ginsberg comes along and says, okay, this is how far we can take it? Let's play.
And he does.
Let's see what we can do with this, fellas. And he does. And so now, the narrative shifts again.
Yep.
because it's in a postmodern objective. And of course, here's the thing about the postmodern, right? We could argue about something happened in 1945.
Yes.
Because the art reflects that. And we could argue all the semantics about postmodern, when the postmodern happened, what stages the postmodern happened, and all that stuff. The reality is that the minute we dropped the bomb, it went from we can slaughter a lot of people to we can destroy the universe.
Yep.
Overnight. And it's reflected in the art.
Yep.
Because they start playing with it, right? I mean, Cat's Cradle is built on this simple premise. We're going to destroy the universe. At the very end of the book, it's exactly what happens, right? Not giving away the ending, though. I'm not going to tell you how he does it because it's hilarious.
Oh my God!
It's so funny.
The part that we have trouble reading in class too. Our students, my God, I can't believe you said that out loud. Like, yeah, there it is, kids.
There it is. So,
someone else found the orgasm.
So Ginsberg. So what Ginsberg does is he changes the narrative again, and the narrative is now that there is no narrative. The narrative gets swallowed by the mass market.
Yep.
And you go into a repeating pattern.
Yep. And I would say from a poet's perspective, if you look at life after Howl, poetry has never successfully really written a lot of great narrative poems.
Yeah.
The narrative poem in its older form is gone.
Yeah.
I mean, you see narrative poems from time to time, but they're kind of like, they're interesting, but they're not very good.
Yeah.
And certainly book-length narrative poems have disappeared. They're just gone. They're gone. So now it's all lyrical. I mean, you'll see poets write narrative poems still, but as far as poets who are pushing the envelope, the way poets have chosen to push the envelope now is to write poetry that is so dense that meaning is no longer possible.
Yeah.
So we've gotten past narrative to the point where we say that poems can't even mean anything.
Yeah.
Much less tell a story. That is a significant shift.
But I will tell you this. When we look at The Wasteland and Howl, both, you were saying that, we got to a point where the narrative poem was not critiquing culture anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Because we see that show up around Rime of the Ancient Mariner.
Yeah.
And then forward. We get to The Wasteland and how these are the ultimate criticisms.
They are.
They go beyond criticizing a single entity and they start criticizing humanity.
We circle back.
Yeah.
Yeah, we circle back. It's Beowulf for the vengeance.
Yeah. It's humanity.
It is humanity. I missed a poem, and I'm rather embarrassed about it, because the one time period we didn't talk about is the Victorian era.
Yeah.
And that's my field.
Yeah.
Was Idylls of the King, which is about King Arthur by Tennyson. It's a book-length poem of shorter poems about King Arthur.
I didn't know about this.
Yeah, well, it's great, and it reveals the obsession that the Victorians had with Arthurian legend.
Yeah.
So that's all I'm going to say about that, because we've already gone past that point.
Yeah.
But I don't see.
So what do you think about narrative poetry? Do you think we're going to see?
It's gone.
It's gone?
It's gone. I think it's gone for good.
You don't think it's going to change?
I think the only way we're going to see narrative poetry again is if the novel suddenly dies.
Right. But you don't think it'll change?
No. Well, okay. To what? What? You tell me, and you're not wrong.
Yeah.
After The Wasteland and Howl, what the hell else is there?
Yeah.
I mean, so the only thing to do now is to write poetry that doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And I can show you reams of great poetry by poets who are writing today that no one talks about, who are writing poems that have pieces of narrative, like The Wasteland,
right,
but are even more obscure than The Wasteland.
Yeah.
But if you've got the novel,
why do you need it?
I think the narrative poem. I think the narrative poem had been displaced by the time that Eliot was writing The Wasteland.
Yeah.
I think Eliot is an aberration. And so is Ginsberg. You don't need narrative poetry anymore. This is what the novel does.
Yeah.
And the novel's peculiar because there are novelists who we consider great, like Steinbeck, who aren't challenging narrative in the way that Eliot did.
Right.
He's telling you a story, and you understand the story from beginning to end. He's not even jumping around. He's just, here's a narrative from point A
to point B.
To point B.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anywhere to go with narrative poetry, unless you want to write narrative poetry like we wrote in the 1900s. And why would you want to go back in the 1800s? Why go back? The whole point of literature is to go forward. And I don't think you can go past Howl. I think you can play with Howl.
I would argue that it moved, it jumped to pop lyrics.
I think you could make that claim. That's a postmodern idea.
But then the reason why I say that is because you have all these moments in our collective history where the musical artists are commenting and they're using narrative to make that comment. But then it critiques itself. And I'm brought back to the chorus of Teen Spirit. Right? Here we are now, entertain us, give us something. But he's not giving a narrative.
No.
He's actually critiquing the narrative, saying, okay, now give us a narrative.
Yes.
We don't have a narrative.
We don't have a narrative. I think the other thing is that we talk about with postmodernism, it's the end of history.
Yeah.
Right? If it's the end of history, what possible story can you tell?
Yeah.
I think you end up telling the same old stories again. But again, the question is, if we have the novel, what can poetry possibly do
that the novel's not?
That the novel's not. And I think the answer is, so I think poetry is going to have to move steadily away from the narrative. And if it's going to present narrative, it needs to be a disjointed narrative. But again, what are we doing? We're just pointing back to the wasteland. If you create a disjointed narrative, which you'll see certain poets do, but we don't have, if you're talking about, narrative snippets in poems, we can continue to do. But an extended narrative, like The Wasteland, like Howl, no. Again, moments in it, but nothing like that. I don't see, and I'm not insulting poetry or poets. I'm not even saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying, I just don't see it.
Yeah.
I don't even know what that would look like, and I think about this on a daily basis.
Right.
I live and breathe poetry. It's my life, and I just can't, for the life of me, figure out where this would possibly go.
Yeah.
What's up?
Hey.
Hi.
Hi. Hi.
I can't possibly figure out where this is going to go.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with poetry that is completely divorced from narrative. That's fine with me.
Yeah.
Because no one does it better than the novelists do.
No.
What the hell am I going to do that Don DeLillo can't? Seriously.
You're going to do it in verse.
I guess, but why would I?
Why would you? Yeah, because they're not asking for it.
No. Well, and then beyond that, it's like, I'm only going to do it if I think I can do it better. I can't do it better.
Right.
And I don't know of a single poet who can do, no one's going to be better at it than DeLillo and Pynchon and Cormac McCarthy. Yeah. So don't even waste your time. Just write.
Right.
And write really great shit. But don't worry about narrative anymore. That's gone. Eliot and Ginsberg killed it.
Yeah.
Just write.
And I think that's what Williams and Stevens were mad about most, and more.
Well, okay, so Williams, and I guarantee you Moore and Stevens had the same problem. Williams is pissed because Eliot takes the poem away from the people.
And gives it to the Academy.
And Williams is like, you have got to be kidding me. We worked so hard. Even Pound worked hard to wrest it away from the Academy.
Yeah.
And Pound is complicit in giving it back.
Yeah.
This is why, this is why you'll talk to people. They either side with Williams or they side with Eliot. You don't meet many people who love them both.
Yeah.
I'm one of the few people who love them both. I really do. I love them both. But if I got to choose a side,
Williams.
I'm going to choose Williams.
Well, I'm going to pick Pound every day.
Because Williams also wrote a narrative poem, a book-length poem,
Yeah.
called Patterson. And it's disjointed and hard to make sense of. And he includes pieces of letters that people wrote him and newspaper clippings in the poem. And it's a narrative, but it's really hard to get through.
Yeah.
And this is actually probably, so Howell is looking at the wasteland, but it's also looking at Patterson.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the letters that Williams pulls from and puts in the wasteland is a letter from Ginsberg.
Right. Well, Ginsberg was...
So yeah, and you asked me the question, I'll ask you the question.
Yeah.
Is honest to God, you actually think that there's a possibility of narrative poetry again, or am I right? It's the novel now. Forget pop lyrics, because I'm not saying they can't do it there. They do it there.
No, I think that's where it went. I think it jumped genres.
Did you think we can ever come back, or even should go back?
I do. Do I think... Okay, should we? That's not a question I can answer. Whether or not we should or should not.
Oh, I can, yeah.
But...
The novel does it better.
Can we? Yeah, I think we can. And I think it'll be on a digital platform. Because I think the next renaissance is going to be a digital renaissance if we're not already there. And I think you're going to find narrative poetry come back through digital platforms.
Okay, fine. Okay. I'm not saying...
And it's going to tell those stories.
I'm not saying it won't. But is it going... And this is the thing.
Because, well, here's the thing. Okay. What is the... Again, let's go all the way back to Gilgamesh.
Yeah.
Okay? What was the purpose? To tell the story.
I agree with you. So far, I'm not in disagreement with you.
I agree that the novel tells the story easier.
It does.
What happens, though, when you cut creatives loose in a new platform? They start to experiment,
Okay, so
right?
we have to... So what we haven't... And we need... I don't... How long have we been talking?
Oh, a long time. We're going to just keep going.
I'll wrap it up. I'll wrap my side up this way.
Okay.
You have to distinguish between conventional poetry and the avant-garde.
Right.
Conventional poetry never stopped writing narratives because it just pretended like the wasteland never happened.
Right.
It just said, screw it.
Right.
We're just going to write. Hence you get Plath. We didn't talk about Plath.
No.
These short narrative pieces like Daddy
Yeah.
and The Jailer, his night sweats grease my breakfast plates.
Well, we
my
didn't talk
night
about
sweat.
HD either.
We didn't.
But she's doing these small.
She's doing the small ones too, but there are a lot of conventional poets who are perfectly happy writing about the first time they masturbated. We've got poems like that. We've got poems about this incident that happened to them when they were 10.
Okay, so let me say this.
But that's the conventional poetry.
Yeah. There was a book several years ago where the author, I can't remember who wrote it, it was some up-and-coming author, wrote the entire book in text messages. The entire book was text messages going back and forth between the characters. Okay? That's what I'm talking about. They'll find ways to incorporate verse into this new platform, and in order for the verse to make sense, they'll structure a narrative. I think that's where we're going.
I thought it would be cool to write, and I've thought about it, but I've never done it, to write a poem that is only digital, that has hyperlinks that link you to other poems that you're supposed to read that way.
That would be cool. But
I'm not that guy.
Okay, so here's the problem with that, right? Because the minute you do that, you're giving ode to Eliot and Pound and those fucking footnotes.
You are? But instead of linking it to a footnote, you're linking it to another poem that you would read in concert.
Well, I mean, that's the same thing.
Yeah.
Because you look at Eliot's footnotes and you have to go and read them.
Yeah.
In order to understand what he's doing with those 4 lines. So you're coming back to what Eliot did.
Yeah. I don't know.
I do think we could, and I think it will.
I think there's room. You understand? Okay, so I'm not saying there's not room for poetry to grow. I think there is. I just don't know that it's going to happen in the narrative vein. I think poetry will continue to grow in the lyrical vein. I have no doubt about that. Poetry never stops.
Right.
And just when you think you've reached the edge, there's always something else. Because we've if you look back at the past, you've had people saying the same thing. Oh my God, well, no, there's nothing else after this.
Right.
And then there's something else.
There's something else.
I just don't know if
but
it's going to...
But with the wasteland, there really is nothing else. Right? I mean, that's the thing. That's the problem with the wasteland.
I think there's nothing else with narrative poetry.
Yeah.
I think the sky is the limit
for lyrical
poetry. Poetry without narrative can go anywhere. I've seen some of this stuff, right? Like there was a great poet named Ted Berrigan. His two sons, Eddie and Anselm, are writing this really ridiculous, great verse that is kind of influenced by the New York school. But I just don't. They're not. I mean, they're incorporating narrative, but they're not writing extended narrative poems like we had. I think that's gone. I think you'll always have narrative popping up, but an extended treatment. I don't know.
We're going to see.
I don't know. I mean, I think the wasteland...
See what these kids are going to do.
The wasteland ruins the possibility of telling a story from point A to point B.
Yeah.
And I think if the kids are writing poetry after this and writing a narrative, you can't have point A to point B anymore. Not and make it innovative. Because if you go just from point A to point B and you're trying to write experimental verse, you're just going backward, not moving forward.
Right.
Sorry.
Well, no. Well, I will say this, and this is it. Okay? You said, because the key thing you just said there was, and not be innovative. And they said, up to the time that right before he wrote Atonement, they said, you can do it, but you won't be innovative. So what did he do?
Who? McEwen?
McEwen.
Yeah.
He added 5 pages to the end of that book and blew everything up. So I'm going to hold you to that, because as someone told me yesterday, they had an I told you so, and I said, put it in your pocket, you'll never have to use it. Well, I'm going to take my I told you so, I'm going to put it in my pocket, and I will use it.
Well,
because I think there's going to be a kid that's going to figure out a way to innovate A to B narrative poetry.
I hope you're right. Again, it's been done in more traditional poetry.
Right.
So you have to make that distinction between the conventional stuff, where the narrative never died, and the experimental stuff. And not only do I think it's not, I think that a lot of poets don't want to go back. They want to write a poetry that in the vein of Stein rather than in the vein of Eliot. Because Stein eschews meaning.
What does Stein do with Picasso?
Yes.
Right? She builds this fractured narrative, but there is a narrative there. You just have to put it together. So there you go. You know, the language poets are probably, and you know more about the language poets than I do, but they're probably looking at that and saying, let's make it innovative.
Well, they're using narrative too, but we're talking about extended treatments.
Yeah, we're talking about longer pieces.
Yeah. And that no one's really done.
Yeah. No, you're right.
And
it stops with how.
In fact, I think the long poem might, in general, be in a bit of a crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, I've read some. I read a long poem earlier this year, or late last year, called "Have a Good One" by Anselm Berrigan. Anselm Berrigan, that goes on for 50 pages.
Yeah.
And he says nothing, and it is glorious.
So in other words, it's Longfellow for the 21st century.
No, but he's actually got talent.
I understand.
But before I go, something has got to give.
Dude, I set you up like 10 times and you didn't grab it.
I know.
All right, I'm Barbara, that's Dr. J. Peace.
Now it's time for Dr. J.